Okay, so as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about naturalism, functionalism, and the metaphysics of science. And the main aim, So the main aims of this talk are methodological. I'm going to include some examples from the metaphysics of science along the way, but the main aim is to take a naturalistic approach to the metaphysics of science and explain what that amounts to. And I'm going to argue that if you take this kind of naturalistic approach, considerations of agency are going to turn out to play a role even when you're doing the metaphysics of relatively fundamental physics, and that should be some kind of surprise. I'm going to give a few examples of how this methodological naturalism has consequences for debates in metaphysics of science. So the examples are going to come primarily from talking about the direction of time, and also from thinking about scientific modal relations such as laws, probabilities, and causation. So the plan is as follows. I'll spend the first section talking about what it is to do the metaphysics of science in this naturalistic way. I'll then apply this kind of methodologically to thinking about some debates about the direction of time. I'll then move on to talk about why agency and considerations of function are going to turn out to play a role when doing metaphysics. And then finally, I'll end with some implications for debates about modal relations, and particularly for whether we can endorse Humean accounts of modal relations. So when doing the metaphysics of science, I'm going to offer a very minimal definition of what it is to do metaphysics. So roughly speaking, metaphysics is an investigation that involves asking questions like, what is there? What are these things like? Why are they like this? And how do these things relate to one another? This is obviously a very, I would say, minimal definition of metaphysics, but it'll turn out that a lot of empirical investigations are going to count as metaphysics, even if they're not done by people that we would typically label as metaphysicians. If we're doing the metaphysics of science, then we're going to be investigating those kinds of things that are also investigated by the sciences. So metaphysics of science is still going to cover an awful lot. Now, in offering this very minimal definition of metaphysics, here are some things that I'm not going to take metaphysics to, by definition, be committed to. So we don't have to employ some methodology that goes beyond science. That's not required to do metaphysics. Nor do we have to necessarily lay out what the essence or the natures of things are. It might be enough to just say what they are and what they're like. And finally, we don't necessarily have to employ a notion of metaphysical fundamentality as some kind of, roughly speaking, extra scientific form of dependence of a kind not used familiarly in the empirical sciences. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that you could never make use of any of these notions, things like essences or metaphysical fundamentality. I just don't think it should be part of the buy-in for doing metaphysics. So you can do metaphysics even if you're not addressing these kinds of questions. As it turns out, not surprisingly, I don't think we should be using these things, but I'm not going to make an argument about definition at this point. And also regarding whether we can call this kind of investigation metaphysics of science in general, I think it does have enough in common with what we typically call metaphysics of science to warrant the name, but I'm also not going to argue over semantics. I would be happy for you to call it ontology of science or something else. So when we start thinking about what it might be to do metaphysics in a naturalistic way, often you find a division between two types of naturalism. So one is called ontological naturalism, and it's primarily a claim about what exists, maybe also sometimes under the label of physicalism. And we say that all that exists is physical, or all that exists is what science says there is. And our main claim is kind of demarcating what the appropriate ontology should be. A slightly different point of view on naturalism is methodological naturalism, which is basically an attitude or a method of adopting the methods of science when doing philosophy. And that won't necessarily mean we have to do kind of exactly what the scientists do, but we should be doing things that are in a very strong sense continuous with ordinary practices in science. And we're not necessarily going to be focusing on answering ontological questions or asking these broad questions sort of from the outside, what is there? So one reason, at least, that I'm a bit skeptical about starting with ontological naturalism is that it is sometimes suggested that there's sort of a standpoint from outside of science from which we can evaluate and then choose to affirm the existence claims of science, or perhaps even some subset of them. And the thought with methodological naturalism is that's a mistake. There is, as it were, kind of no place to stand outside science and decide to follow the edicts of science. We are, as it were, just doing science, working from within, in a phrase that's sometimes used. So given all that, I'm going to suggest we should be methodological naturalists when doing the metaphysics of science. Now, methodological naturalism might be a more difficult buy-in in some areas of philosophical inquiry. So if we're thinking about things like ethics or politics or religion, maybe there's some kind of reasons to be skeptical at this point. But I think it's a good default when our subject matter is explicitly those things investigated by the sciences. At least for the minimal definition of metaphysics I've begun with, it's hard to see why we should be going beyond the methods of science if that's going to be able to answer the questions that we'd like to for the things investigated by the sciences. So without further defense, I'm basically going to adopt methodological naturalism from this point and see where it takes us. At least, again, for doing the metaphysics of science. Now, just to note, this kind of methodological naturalism is substantially stronger than a lot of positions that are typically labeled naturalism or projects that are interested in naturalizing metaphysics. So often naturalizing metaphysics is taken to be something like metaphysics appropriately informed by the sciences, or metaphysics that takes off where scientific method leaves off. And there's this idea here that, science is good within its domain and is kind of the starting point for metaphysics. But then once science has kind of run out, we then need to bring in a distinctly metaphysical method to answer certain kinds of questions. And methodological naturalism is distinctly opposed to that point of view. It doesn't think that scientific method ever kind of runs out. We should just keep doing more science, and there won't be any interesting metaphysical questions that require going beyond the bounds of scientific method. Okay, now, why are we doing this? The why I'm going to answer here is why do we think that there should be philosophers doing this kind of activity if we already have scientists doing scientific investigations? So I think there is plenty of room for philosophy of this kind of very naturalized sort, even if we're sort of, being kind of fully subscribed naturalists. So often metaphysics is going to go beyond the interests of ordinary science because it's taking place across several domains of science and, pursuing certain kinds of questions that particular sciences may not be interested in. So one can be considering topics that are just too general to be encompassed by a single domain. I have in mind, for example, things like accounts of causation. It's hard to think of there being a scientific area that studies causation as such. Secondly, there's going to be areas where our pre-theoretic intuitions, rightly or wrongly, have played some kind of role in theory choice. And once we've noted this, we then want to sort of investigate the origin or reliability of these intuitions to have a good debate. And so you end up sort of having to bring in considerations from psychology and quite high-level sciences, even when the original theories we were thinking about were ones about, for example, primitive ontology or the direction of time or the direction of causation. So this is another area where we're going to need to bring in considerations from different domains in a way that isn't necessarily going to be supported within standard scientific practice. And finally, just more general, if you're interested in questions about how domains relate. So for addressing, these kinds of questions, philosophy is likely to have a more significant role to play, and you'll get these kind of investigations taking place sort of not within what's typically called science, but within what's typically called philosophy, and there'll be some kind of metaphysics of science that isn't practiced by scientists. And this will be okay. It won't be a sign that things have gone wrong. So, so how are we going to go about doing methodological naturalism? One is we might still be interested in figuring out how to read ontology off our theories, more in the direction of ontological naturalism, because I don't think those methodological naturalism and ontological naturalism are always so directly opposed. But some other projects might be just improving how well our theories cohere with one another, as well as testing and improving our theories. And most of my suggestions for today for how to do metaphysics naturalistically is going to count under the second one of improving how well our theories cohere with one another. So the way I'm going to come at this is by suggesting that there are certain kinds of explanatory demands that we can place very generally on theories. So these are demands that any naturalistic theory, given whatever appropriate background theory, has to be able to meet. And in a certain sense, they're going to seem very weak, but they're going to kind of make up for their weakness by their incredible generality and the fact that they can be demanded of any theory. And I'm going to use a few case studies to argue that they do place substantive restrictions on theories in a way that can guide theory choice in metaphysics of science. And even though they're demands that can be placed on any naturalistic theory, given the way metaphysics of science discussions have gone, they're going to be particularly relevant for debates in this area. So I'm just going to roughly demarcate these kinds of epistemic demands. They fall into three groups. I'm not going to be too precise about exactly what form the demand takes, but I'm happy to take more questions on that. So the first class is a class of epistemic demands. So given a theory that's being proposed, you have to be able to explain naturalistically how you come to know the relevant entities and their features in whatever way is posited by the theory. So given a theory posits certain entities and certain features of these entities, the theory, given its background, has to be able to explain how you come to know that theory, essentially. This is going to have a number of implications, but one clear one is it can't be the fact that the truth of a theory undermines its evidential basis. That is, it can't be the fact that if you think the theory is true, or if the theory is true, you would no longer have reason for thinking it's true. This would be very bad indeed. This is what happens in Boltzmann brane scenarios and in certain versions of interpretations of quantum mechanics. I'm happy to go through these in more detail in Q&A, but essentially these are case studies where if the theory was true, it would turn out that all your evidence for it was misleading, because all your evidence in general is very misleading. And this would be an example of not just failing the epistemic demand, but meeting the epistemic demand being impossible given the theory. So the second set of demands are what I'm calling appearance demands. And here you have to be able to explain naturalistically how you came to have certain experiences or intuitions or beliefs that were apparently about those entities. And these might be the kind of intuitions that you've begun your investigation with, or it might be intuitions that you sort of still have at the end. But either way, insofar as you have these kind of, broadly speaking, opinions about these entities or these the features of the entities, the theory has to explain, given background, why you have those experiences. And finally, and I'll talk more about these a fair bit later on, there are what I'm calling the conceptual demands, where you have to be able to explain naturalistically how you came to have and reason with the relevant concepts that feature in the theory. So the theory can't leave it mysterious how you came to even conceive of the theory in the first place. Okay. Again, I'm not being too careful on whether these are all the explanatory demands you might put on theories. There also might be redundancies between these demands, depending on what form you put them in. But I think these three important kinds, they will play an important role in what follows. Also a note, you can think of some of these in terms of coherence demands, some of these more in terms of kind of recovering the starting point, but that's not a very neat division. So there's different ways to think of these ones, but here they all are. Now, we're going to be in trouble, or our theory is going to be in trouble, if it gives no answer to these kind of explanatory demands. It's going to be in even more trouble if there's reason to think these demands can't be met. This happens, for example, with the evidential undermining scenarios. But we're not going to be in trouble for the following kinds of reasons. So we're not going to be in trouble if our intuitions are all mistaken. So even though we have this appearance demand to explain our intuitions, the intuitions themselves don't necessarily point towards truth. They don't have any kind of privileged epistemic or evidential role of indicating the truth of the given theory. So it's no cost to a theory if it turns out that given the truth of that theory, all your intuitions were mistaken. I'm also going to say that we're not in trouble if certain kinds of metaphysical questions we might have wanted answers to actually remain unanswered. And I have in mind give it certain structures of theories or choices of ontology or ideology. So basically equivalent theories where different, arguably equivalent versions of this theory push different structure into the ontology or sort of more structural claims about the ontology. Again, I'm not going to talk about case studies here, but I think we should sort of leave open this possibility. Effectively, I'm being more committed to the naturalism and to doing the metaphysics naturalistically than to any kind of starting demands we may have had for metaphysics beyond the very minimal ones that I started with. And again, even those might be given up in certain cases. So having very briefly laid out these explanatory demands, which I take to be kind of naturalistic demands, I'm going to apply that kind of methodology for thinking about debates about the direction of time. So one debate to be had about the direction of time is a very simple one. Is there a primitive direction of time? Is there an intrinsic direction to time itself that isn't derivable from something else? Or is the direction of time in some sense to be reduced, i.e. is it nothing more than the direction in which, say, entropy and various other related phenomena lie, perhaps causation, an asymmetry of records and so forth. I'm going to stay pretty neutral on whether this amounts to a reduction of the direction of time or simply claiming there is no direction of time and all there is other relations that are oriented in time. Effectively, the sort of project is similar in either case. The real interest is in explaining why various other phenomena are temporally asymmetric in a way that doesn't presuppose that time itself has a direction. So one way of coming, what I'm going to do here is kind of apply this methodology to thinking about proposals that suggest there is a primitive direction of time. So say we do have a theory that posits a primitive direction of time, but one that has no naturalistic implications for the distribution of matter and or the orientation of various scientific relations. This would be perhaps a rather unusual view, but let's just sort of see where this goes. So if we had such a view, we still had these explanatory demands to meet and we'd have problems meeting them. So we would need to explain naturalistically how we come to know about this primitive direction of time. We'd need to explain how this primitive direction of time gave rise to the experiences of passage and other temporally directed phenomena or apparent phenomena. And we'd also have to explain how we came to have a concept of this primitive direction of time. Now, arguably, if we've posited a primitive direction of time that doesn't have consequences for things like the distribution of matter and the orientation of scientific relations, this is just going to be really hard to meet basically any of these demands. The way it's sometimes put in the literature, the direction of time is just not going to be manifest to us. Around, if you're going to have a theory that posits a primitive direction of time, it had better be one that has naturalistic implications for the distribution of matter and other scientific relations in order to have at least, the starting point for answering these kind of explanatory demands. So thinking about this in respect to the way metaphysical debates about time have gone, when we had early A theorists, and by this I mean kind of a lot of views about time even before we had the AB theory terminology. So we have theories that posit that the world is divided into past, present, and future, where there are objective facts about what events are present and what events are present will change over time in one direction. And my suggestion is that, for early A theorists, they didn't typically consider these explanatory demands because they didn't really have to. The idea was you were presenting a metaphysical picture of the world that accorded with your intuitions, and so you didn't have to offer further defense of why you were offering this picture. It seemed kind of intuitive. But then when we had, B theorists coming along and suggesting the world wasn't fundamentally divided into past, present, and future, and offered a more surprising picture of how the world sort of operates through time, there was this pressure now to start to answer these kind of explanatory demands, because the theory was no longer a direct reflection of our intuitions. You had to explain, for example, how our intuitions would arise, even though the world was radically different. So, B theorists did begin to answer these kinds of explanatory demands, and often in broadly naturalistic terms. So using the kinds of resources and relations like causation that were used in the sciences. So for example, explaining why time appears to pass without presuming that it does. Now, as the debate has gone on, current A theorists have also now been kind of pressured to get involved in answering these kind of explanatory demands. But I'm going to suggest that they typically do so by giving non-naturalistic answers, if any. And so by this, I mean, insofar as they're offering substantial explanations, they appeal to explanatory relations which aren't the familiar kind that we see in other sciences. Quick example here. Pryor gave a thank goodness that's over argument, where the argument was that in order to make sense of attitudes like relief towards events being past rather than future, there had to be some objective property of pastness that these kind of events had that would explain our attitudes towards them. But it's very difficult to see in sort of broadly naturalistic terms why an event having this metaphysical property would warrant a certain reactive attitude on our part, or would lead to or explain us having these certain kinds of reactive attitudes. I've done my best very genuinely to try and kind of flesh out what the argument might be here, but certainly you don't have what looks like a sort of typical naturalistic explanation. So we have what I'm also calling quasi-A-theorists. I apologize for the terminology, but it's used in many different ways. These are effectively people who accept a primitive direction of time, but don't employ a privileged objective present. And they include people like Tim Maudlin and Matthias Frisch. And, I'm going to say that these theorists in this group typically do attempt to address the explanatory demands, but I'm going to say the details are murky, and I'll give a couple of slides on that in a moment. But we also have another group I'm going to call the quasi-B theorists, and these are people like Craig Callender and Natalia Deng. And these people are definitely interested in answering the explanatory demands in naturalistic terms, but don't take their answers to settle the traditional A versus B theory debate over ontology. And this is, in a sense, an example of what I was talking about earlier, where you can be a kind of card-carrying methodological naturalist and do a lot of metaphysical work without your main goal to answer certain ontological questions, and indeed in their cases, even having positive reason to think those ontological debates are ill-formed. So I mentioned I was unhappy with certain kinds of explanations given by these quasi-A theorists. So I'll use Tim Maudlin as my main example here. So Tim Maudlin posits a temporal asymmetry either in time or production as the kind of basic element. And this is meant to imply that initial microstates are necessarily typical, it's a technical term, given their macro state. So effectively, it's very similar, but not the same as putting something like a probability distribution over initial states, but not final states. And the idea is this temporal asymmetry of time or production is going to itself imply a temporal asymmetry in laws and causation and further relations as well. Now, I just want to briefly raise very general problems with this kind of approach that make me think the details are murky. One is that in and of itself, putting any constraints on the initial condition by themselves will not guarantee that any asymmetries of time or production of laws are actually manifest in temporally asymmetric phenomena around us. To guarantee that, you need to add in something like a low entropy condition or gradient, or else a constraint on final conditions to guarantee you have any kind of asymmetry, basically, in the statistical conditions. So you're not actually getting any account of how you could come to know this primitive direction of time unless you add some further features beyond what is given in the account. And a second, and I think more worrying concern, is just what to make of these implications that I've put in orange here. So there's meant to be some kind of relation between this deep temporal asymmetry of production or time and these statistical claims and these claims about laws. But, I find it quite mysterious, what that implication is supposed to be. And it's very tempting to say, look, if we're interested in giving naturalistic explanations of phenomena, why not just start with the asymmetries in probability that are then supposed to give rise to the asymmetries elsewhere and things like entropy? So again, it's not that naturalism is incompatible with positing a primitive direction of time. We may have reason to do so, but at least working within the kind of classical Boltzmannian program, I don't think these kind of explanations are working out in naturalistic terms. I'll just briefly mention Matthias Fisch, who has a related, similar but somewhat different account. He also posits a primitive direction of time, which is meant to imply some kind of asymmetry in statistical independence, as well as, or this temporal asymmetry of time implies a temporal asymmetry of causation. And he talks about them as being two aspects of a fundamental temporal asymmetry in the world. But again, I find it hard to read kind of what these implications are. Sometimes the account is also spoken of as non-reductive, even though you are deriving the causal asymmetry. So the structure I find difficult to read. And again, there's this thought, why not just start with the statistical asymmetries and derive things from that? What work is being done by adding in this claim about a primitive direction of time beyond what is done by the statistical asymmetries? So again, it's not that you can't explain naturalistically explain temporal asymmetries using a primitive direction of time, and we may have reason to in some settings, but the kind of prominent proposals for necessarily having to do so, even in these kind of classical Boltzmannian settings, I don't think even really attempt this. Insofar as there's interesting work being done here, it's all being done by the asymmetric probabilistic posits. Conversely, however, there are sustained attempts to explain a range of temporal asymmetries without a primitive direction of time. And I have in mind, the work of a huge number of people, but including people like Reichenbach and David Albert and Callender and Papineau and Price, amongst many others. I've defended some of this elsewhere. I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A. And, the idea is that these temporal asymmetries, they might turn out to capture what we want to mean by the direction of time. But even so, the program here is now explaining these temporal asymmetries without a primitive direction of time, and thinking that's the best kind of naturalistic approach to the metaphysics of the direction of time. Okay, so again, not to say that you could never end up with a primitive, the naturalistic explanatory demands support reductive explanations. Okay, and now I want to move on to thinking about, why did I mention this stuff about agency and function at the start? Sort of what role do these play in doing the metaphysics of science? So first off, I just want to note that none of the explanatory demands that I mentioned implies any kind of anti-realism. So we're not getting into a kind of mind-dependent picture of the world by adopting these explanatory demands. However, one thing that's clear is that, in answering these explanatory demands, we're going to have to think about some kind of features of ourselves. If you're answering the epistemic demands about how we come to know the theory, you're going to have to include something about our cognitive abilities, perceptual apparatus, things like this. If you're answering the appearance demands, you're going to again have to think about our perceptual apparatus, perhaps our pre-theoretical intuitions and the sources of these kinds of things. And for the conceptual demands, you're going to have to think about the basis on which we form concepts. So this is actually part of the reason why I think answering these demands has often required some cross-disciplinary activity. So this is why some recent work in philosophy of time also features, physics and psychology coming together because they're trying to answer the explanatory demands. And again, partly why these kind of investigations aren't necessarily featuring within ordinary science. But, if this is right, if thinking about ourselves is relevant to us, even when you're doing the metaphysics of relatively fundamental physics, even though we ourselves might be thought of as quite high level beings to be understood in high level terms, you still have to answer these demands even when you're doing fundamental physical theories. Now, the epistemic and appearance demands, I think, are often the most discussed in the literature on the metaphysics of time. These ones do get kind of given some airplay. Some suggestions for why, people do take their claims to knowledge quite seriously, and there is a kind of ongoing program of epistemology naturalized. with the appearance demands, people often also take their intuitions very seriously. And there's also this ongoing program of philosophy of mind, naturalized. But, the conceptual demands are equally important, despite not being, I think, spoken about as much. And recall, this is to explain naturalistically how we come to have the relevant concepts and reason in those terms. So if we're thinking about how we might explain how we come by some concepts in general, here are some approaches which I think are taken by philosophers. One I'm just calling descriptive flat-footism, where the thought is just because those things exist, that by itself offers an explanation of how we come to have concepts of those things. A second I'm calling metaphysical magnetism. I'm worried magnetism might be a misleading term here, but I'm going with it pending a suggested alternative. Here you say we come by a concept because those things exist and are metaphysically special in some kind of way. So often the thought is that these things are metaphysically fundamental, and that by itself will justify why we come to have a concept of those things. Price sometimes complains about the use of what he calls substantive reference relations, which I think is a similar kind of complaint. But a third kind of approach, which I think is much more respectably naturalistic, is what I'm going to call naturalistic functionalism. And that's to think that we come by concepts in general because reasoning using those concepts is useful to us. And I have in mind here the kind of programs pursued by Quine, Carnap, and Hugh Price. Now, it's not to say that we should always be functionalists if we're naturalists. If a domain is kind of in disarray and not serving a function, maybe the best naturalistic story of why we came by those concepts will not involve anything about those concepts being useful. But, in domains where everything is going well and the domain is functioning as it should, we'll acquire the concepts of those domains because they're useful for us. So again, a quick illustration of here, the explanatory demands for early A theorists, I suggested earlier they sort of often didn't consider these explanatory demands. And part of my suggestion is ultimately because of descriptive flat-footism. The thought is that if the picture of the world I'm presenting in my metaphysics is very close to how it seems intuitively to you, I don't have to consider sort of why you would come by your intuitions. Sort of merely the fact that the world is a certain way explains why we ultimately come to think of it in that way and why we acquire those concepts. Current A theorists, I'm going to suggest typically give non-naturalistic answers to why we come by the relevant concepts. Often involving some kind of metaphysical epistemic magnetism. So because the world is fundamentally divided into a past, present, and future, we will develop concepts accordingly. And while B theorists and quasi-B theorists don't necessarily frame their explanations in terms of concepts and function, they often are interested in giving kind of naturalistic resources that can explain why we develop concepts of the present, the flow of time, etc. Partly again because they're interested in explaining how we come to have knowledge and how we come to have certain experiences about the world as well. So for example, Craig Callender will say things like, look, given the kind of energy and length scales and speeds of our perceptual apparatus and actions, we will take ourselves to inhabit a shared present and therefore develop a concept of such. For someone like Reichenbach, in the direction of time, given that there are these temporal asymmetries in knowledge, causation, and other phenomena, we will take there to be a direction. So saying that the thing has to be useful to us if we're to develop the concept is a pretty kind of open idea. There are different ways that something might be relevant to us. But I'm going to suggest that often in metaphysical debates, it's our status as agents, the kind of physically located beings who can take in information and make choices based on this information. It's our status as agents that's typically what's relevant in many. So just to note as well, like often thinking about function as thinking about agency has been associated with a kind of anti-realism or sort of with a kind of anti-metaphysics and being kind of inimical to the metaphysical project. So Hugh Price, for example, who, in many ways, my work here is quite informed by, but I'm going to differ with him on this point. He applies a kind of global pragmatist position, which says, we should be thinking about the function of our concepts like causation, but we should not attempt an account of what causation is like. To do that is to kind of make some kind of mistake. This is not what the metaphysical enterprise should be about. We should focus on function at the expense of accounts. And you also sort of might try and derive a similar thought from some of Carnap's writings. You might say, look, questions about the function of our concepts are, in Carnap's terms, external questions. They're asked external to a given framework. They're not internal questions that use the concepts. And so it might seem like if we're asking these external questions about function, we're not going to be able to come up with any kind of account of what the thing itself is like, and we're not going to be doing metaphysics in any reasonable sense. Now, I think both of these kind of implications are a mistake. So even if you're explicitly concerned with the function of concepts, often the function of a concept is going to in part depend on the existence and features of the thing itself. So if you're wanting a good naturalistic story about why we developed the concept of water, part of that story is going to involve the fact that water exists, we can know about it, and it's relevant for our survival. So it's not agency or the world featuring in these kind of naturalistic explanations, it's presumably both in typical cases. And for what it's worth, I think Carnap and Quine agree, on important points for me about how to do this kind of naturalistic metaphysics or ontology. So Price, when thinking about, for example, causation, is going to argue that it serves a certain function. We use it to express certain conditional beliefs, but that's where his account of causation ends. He doesn't want to give an account of what causation itself is. But I think, we can kind of be inspired by claims about the function of a term and then go on to give a naturalistic story about what that thing actually is. So a naturalistic functionalist might point out that causal relations track, real, objective, chance-like probabilistic relations of how basically states that we might be interested in bringing about depend on our free choices, again, for appropriately deliberating rational agents. So a few years ago now, I defended a kind of evidential biconditional on the way to giving an account of causation, where A is going to count as a cause of B, just in case an appropriate relation deciding on A for the sake of B would in fact raise the probability of B, where raising the probability of here is not just sort of from the agent's point of view or given epistemic probabilities, but is an actual kind of worldly probabilistic relation. So if you have a biconditional like this one, at the very least, what you get is a kind of correspondence between objective probabilities and causal relations. So a causal relation will obtain just in case that objective probabilistic relation will obtain. But, so what I find nice about this style of account is that you do end up with an account, broadly speaking, of what causation is or when causal relations obtain. But it's one, because of its functionality, that can answer very easily why we come to reason about the world in causal terms. Because we're interested in what kind of free choices we could make would in fact raise the probability of the outcomes we seek. So it's bringing together what is typically a more metaphysical approach with a functionalist approach that, is often thought of in anti-metaphysical terms, but I don't think should be. So if we're doing causation here, again, we're going to need to explain its temporal asymmetry. And if we're relating it to temporal asymmetries in probabilistic structure, this is going to work pretty well. So we already have programs in place that use the resources of statistical mechanics to explain asymmetries in probabilistic structure. And we can then use those to explain the temporal asymmetry of causation if you use this kind of evidential biconditional. So using function here, and with a kind of near correspondence between recognizably naturalistic accounts of the temporal asymmetry of causation. All right, so just in the last, 15, 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about how this naturalism applies to the case of other kinds of modal relations. So one thing to start with, often modal relations of any kind or modality of any kind has seemed kind of inimical to naturalism. So you have Hugh Price and David Papineau saying that, modality is difficult for a naturalist to accommodate. And the arguments seem to be the following form, because of naturalism, we only ever have access to the actual world. And so when we think about how we come to know about or reason using modal relations, we have a kind of puzzle that the naturalist has to face. And it's often also been the case that people who are trying to pursue metaphysics in a naturalistic way have thought that, look, we should think about the function of modal relations precisely in order to reduce modal relations to some non-modal relations. So people like David Lewis and Barry Lower effectively reduce modal relations to patterns, typically in the Humean mosaic, by considering the function of laws and probabilities and so forth. And that's become, in some ways, even more prominent in recent Humean accounts. They're using function to reduce modal relations. And I think, often when you kind of look into the details, part of the motivation for this program is, again, that modality is somehow mysterious, difficult to accommodate, it doesn't fit easily into our natural view of the world, and therefore we should reduce it if we're by any means we can.
We had a quick question, Alison, if it's okay.
Yep, sure.
Someone asked if you'd be willing to define what you mean by modal relations here.
Yes, sorry. It will become a little clearer in a second, but at this point, I have in mind basically causation, laws, probabilities and chances, and counterfactuals. So roughly speaking, relations between events that are thought to very directly have implications for some non-actual events. So not things like relative frequencies, but things like the probability of an event being thus and so. Is that enough by way of clarification?
That's great, thanks.
Cool, thanks. Good reminder. Okay, so at this point, it's just sort of to note in the literature so far, a lot of naturalists have been unhappy about these modal relations. And in this case, I'm going to be particularly worried about, focusing on the modal relation. I think these claims are actually a bit puzzling. So, starting with a kind of more neutral view of the world, it does seem like science is very much up to its neck in modal discoveries. So discoveries about what the laws are, what causal relations obtain, what probabilities obtain. It's kind of puzzling to think that modal relations of these forms were sort of naturalistically suspect right from the start. So, however it is that scientists do discover laws, etc., it is almost by definition through naturalistic methods, given how I'm thinking of naturalism here. It's through observation, experiment, randomized control trials, and what have you. So, however we think of our naturalistic methods of knowing about the world, these aren't just limited to discovering the non-modal actual things. We seem to be able to discover modal stuff as well. And moreover, put the other way around, it's not just that science is interested in discovering what modal relations obtain, it's also interested in using them to then do things like explain and predict and control the world. So my suggestion here is that there isn't a kind of prima facie concern about the naturalistic credentials of modal relations. If we're sort of starting our metaphysics working from within science, we are okay with modal relations being there. Now, it's not to say that we couldn't acquire concerns about whether modal relations are naturalistically respectable. We could. It's just that we don't begin with them as scientists working for within the scientific project. So again, the worry might be that when we look in more detail, it turns out we don't have a reasonable naturalistic account of how we come to know the modal or to have concepts of the modal or so forth. The modality becomes kind of suspect. And I think worries along these lines are what sort of drives problems like Van Frassen's inference identification problems, problems of induction, Lewis's C-Dimly complaint. For those not familiar with these are all issues of the form, you have this modal relation, like a law or a probability. How does it relate to the actual events? Do the laws govern the actual events? How so? Or put the other way around, given we have access to things like the relative frequencies or patterns in actual events, how do we reason to what the laws are or what the probabilities are? There's basically, they're both concerns about how the modal relates to the non-modal. Just 1 second. So I have a small puppy that I'm looking after. Okay. So the worry here might be that, look, if you've got modal relations that are distinct from the actual events that happen, the non-modal actual, then accounts of how modal relations relate to the non-modal are going to presuppose modal relations, and that's going to be viciously circular or otherwise illicit. So for example, if I say things like, look, it's highly probable that the relative frequencies indicate the probabilities, that's not meant to be a good story of how probabilities relate to the relative frequencies, because that story uses probability as one of its terms. So put the other way around, it seems like only if you have some kind of reduction of laws and probabilities to sort of actual events, for example, a reduction of probabilities to relative frequencies, can you have some kind of non-probabilistic guarantee that relative frequencies indicate probabilities and have a kind of non-circular account of how the modal relations relate to the non-modal. But I think this is all kind of a mistake. So, you know, the point at the beginning was that there weren't any prima facie concerns about the naturalistic credentials of modal relations. You know, again, we might acquire such concerns, but to begin with, we're happy to employ them in naturalistic explanations. So similarly there should be no starting problem with applying modal relations in naturalistic accounts of how we come to know the modal. Again, you can use these to tell a story about how you come to know what the probabilities are. And I think to think otherwise, to think that you can't employ modal relations and doing so is viciously circular, is effectively to kind of give weight to these, what I'm calling non-naturalistic concerns about the mysteriousness of the modal. And I'm calling them non-naturalistic because they're not motivated by how modality is being used in science. They're kind of claims that modality is metaphysically mysterious in some way that's not reflected by scientific practice. So, you know, there's many different ways you can talk about the relation between the modal and the non-modal, but one very simple account is to say something like, look, it's just highly probable that relative frequencies over sufficiently long runs indicate the probabilities, and just use that as part of your story about how you come to know what the probabilities are. And to do so is to sort of employ a respectively naturalistic explanation that answers to the kind of explanatory demands that I began with. So the other thing, I mean, so far what I've been arguing is that there isn't a problem if you have modal relations in your naturalistic ontology. You can then use these modal relations to explain how you come to know the modal. But I think there's also, independently of that good story, problems with these so-called Humean attempts to reduce the modal to the non-modal. I'm going to suggest they end up flouting the methodological naturalism. So the way to come at this is that, you know, these Humeans like Lewis and Lower are interested in the function of modality. And they are interested in why we come to use modal concepts. And along the way, they start asking questions like, okay, so what are the implications of the probabilities being thus and so? But, you know, they're going to end up giving two different kinds of answers. So if you're a naturalist and you ask, what are the implications of the probabilities being thus and so? The answer is always, those are standard probability theory. Sorry, hang on. If you're putting on your sort of Humean hat, the answer to like, what are the implications of the probabilities being thus and so is something much more complicated. It's something like the best systematization of the actual world is such that these are counted as the probabilities. So even if you ask, like in a very particular case, what are the implications of heads being 0.5 at a, say, very simple world, you know, the naturalist is going to say, look, it's probable that roughly half of the coin tosses will come up heads. The Humean is going to say it's guaranteed that roughly half of the coin tosses will come up heads. Why? Because on the Humean account, the probabilities are just effectively axioms that feature or things derived from axioms that feature in best summarizing the actual events. And these have to get the probability axioms pretty close to what the relative frequencies are if they're going to be included in the best system. And I can talk through this example in more detail. But effectively, when it comes to thinking about why modal relations are useful to us, the Humean starts reducing them to things, to actual events in probability theory. So they're effectively departing from methodological naturalism. They're no longer employing scientific reasoning when thinking about why modality is useful to us. So just to be clear here, I mean, the worry isn't that the Humeanism, it's offering kind of circular explanations. If we're going to be methodological naturalists, you very much should expect circularity in some of your explanations when you're using science to explain how we reason to science and why science is useful and so forth. The worry about these Humean accounts is that effectively the Humean account of what modal relations are just doesn't cohere with standard probability theory. So effectively, chances are going to have different implications for the world, depending on whether you adopt a kind of metaphysical view of them or a scientific view of them. And partly one of the points of being a methodological naturalist is you can't separate those two views. There's only one view to adopt. So effectively what's going on here is Humeanism is breaking the unity of science. Now, I haven't said much about what I take the unity of science to be, so I'm just going to, in the last few minutes, sort of gesture at that because this actually underlies some of the work that was done earlier as well. So I have in mind, we don't have to adopt what would typically be called a kind of strong kind of reductionism, but we can simply require that the claims of different areas or parts of science cohere and match up well enough. So say I'm interested in deriving the behavior of a duck, I can derive its behavior using different areas of science, and the derivations have to accord reasonably well with one another, or that at least one of these sciences either needs revision or was inappropriately applied or applied outside its domain. So it's a kind of consilience approach to the unity of science. So, it's partly for this reason that having the unity of science is what kind of directed me to this account of causation. You're getting, claims about how objects at different levels relate, and I think this is all good. So in the case of the duck, you want the results of the different sciences to all be in accord. But in the case of the Humean accounts of modality, it turns out that the results of metaphysics and science are not in accord. Probabilities have different implications depending on whether you think about them scientifically, where you get the implications of standard probability theory, or metaphysically, where you get where they have the kind of implications that you get given a Humean metaphysics that reduces modal relations to patterns in actual events. Okay? And it's that kind of difference implication that is breaking what would otherwise be the unity of science. Okay. So the view I'm pushing here is that if we're going to be methodological naturalists about the metaphysics of science, we should be led to reject these Humean accounts. It doesn't mean I think we should adopt the sort of standard non-Humean views. So typically non-Humean views, they characterize things like laws and probabilities in temporally asymmetric terms or in terms of causation and production. So the idea is laws produce the future out of the past, or you have chances for future against given past events, but not vice versa. Typical accounts, or sometimes accounts also have some kind of metaphysical notion of governance in there. And the account of modality I have in mind is none of those things, basically. I think we should have modal relations that typically operate in both directions if the laws do. And I don't think we need to appeal to kind of an extra metaphysical form of governance or something, sorry, an extra scientific form of governance or something like that. Oops, sorry. So conclusion here, I think methodological naturalism of the kind I've laid out is a reasonable choice for doing the metaphysics of science. And it's going to give us interesting things to investigate that go beyond the immediate interests of ordinary scientists. if we adopt this kind of methodological naturalism, we should commit to there being these substantive explanatory demands that any theory must meet. If we're going to meet these demands, we're going to have to appeal to features of agency. These demands, they do help make sense of and even adjudicate and push along metaphysical debates regarding the direction of time and the metaphysics of causation. And note, I haven't even said very much here about what the scientific method even is. And even in this case, I think this kind of methodological naturalism can rule in certain kinds of metaphysical accounts and rule against others, at least at the moment. And most crucially, I think this kind of naturalistic functionalism is going to lead to a non-standard, non-Humean account of modal relations of a kind that I don't think has been very well explored in the literature, but I think fits very neatly with a naturalistic view of the metaphysics of science. Okay, and I'm going to finish there, I think. Thank you.
All right, so welcome back, everybody. I have a whole bunch of questions. At my count, I have 16 questions of my own, and there's also a huge number of questions in the participants list. So we may need the full hour. Chris, why don't you go ahead?
That's very generous. Thank you, Alison. I hope we can talk more about this. I'll leave a question about the C series for another time. The question that has been running through my mind on this is, who is this we who seems to feature in all of your explanatory demands, conceptual demands, etc.? The kind of we who can make explanatory demands, do science, have experiences, acquire concepts. You finally come in the end of your talk to the unity of science, and the kind of relations necessary to make sense of the modality that Lewis tried to simulate. But as you know, Lewis and others had mereological understandings underpinning all of this. I just wondered, how do you see this we?
I mean, I have only like a very flat-footed answer, which makes me think that I'm not getting the force of your question, which is something like, in the case of the epistemic demands, for example, should we adopt the theory? It's presumably some kind of community on the earth itself, some actual agents, whether it includes all the humans, just some of the humans, just the ones interested in science. Presumably it's going to depend on what the phenomena is. So, if in the case of direction of time, can you explain the intuitions of everyone who has experiences that appear to be as of the direction of time? At least at the moment, because we only have access to phenomena like that for humans on this earth, that seems like a good explanatory starting point. Insofar as we get beyond that to creatures on this earth which aren't humans, or to creatures that aren't on earth, we should expand the explanatory demands. But yeah, for a lot of the explanatory demands, they're just about explaining phenomena that we think exists. So it's the limit on that kind of phenomena, or our knowledge of the limit on which phenomena exists, that kind of drives the explanatory demands. But I'm worried again that I've not captured what's worrying you here.
I mean, I don't know the procedure. I don't want to.
You can continue if you have
further.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose. So I'm kind of inclined to a sort of constructive empiricist view, the kind of Van Frassen picture when it comes to philosophy of science. So if you take his view, you need a kind of organism that can have experiences. For a minimal metaphysics to make sense of constructive empiricism, you're going to need an organism. And as we know, it's not straightforward to have a kind of mereology that can generate a kind of organism that can persist through time. And that would be one way of making the unity of science make sense, if you had a mereology of organisms. But as we know, Lewis arguably didn't. So that seems to be different ways of configuring the mereology will give you different. I mean,
maybe this will help address it. There's going to be a lot of circularity here. So when I mentioned that these requirements, these explanatory demands were quite weak, part of what makes them seem weak is that it's saying, using the resources of your theory, can you explain naturalistically, why we'll make it organisms today. Organisms come to have the experiences they do. And, you know, your theory might say certain things about what organisms are and how they're composed and how they persist and so forth. And you're allowed to help yourself to all those claims of your theory when giving your naturalistic explanation. So in that sense, you know, it's not that we kind of independently figure out what theories about organisms are correct and then go on to consider the explanatory demands. We're sort of doing it all together at once. That's why they're kind of, I mentioned them as kind of coherence. We're sort of improving how well our theories cohere with one another. So yeah, there's no like, in a lot of cases, there won't be a single story that's compatible with answering the explanatory demands. They're more like things that kind of drive debates in certain directions. I suggested some points where I think currently they look like dead ends, but certainly, yeah, it's not kind of a sort of starting from the base up, figure out what agents and organisms are, and then figure out your rest of your metaphysics. You're using your accounts of metaphysics to figure out what agents are. At the same time, you're using your accounts of how agents come to know stuff to drive your metaphysics. It's all, yeah, circular and coherence-based, etc.
Thanks.
I actually had a quick follow-up to that. So there is, I think, maybe another way in which so I should say Chris single-handedly reduced my list of questions from 16 to 14 because I had a question about series also, but also this question of we. But I had a follow-up I think is maybe somewhat distinct from Chris's question, although I'm not 100% sure. There are some physical theories in which the question of we becomes very nuanced and very difficult to understand. And the example I'm thinking of is the many worlds interpretation of quantum theory. In the many worlds interpretation, the word we is kind of complicated to answer. There's a proliferation of world branches. There are many descendants that we have. And then asking what we experience is a little bit complicated. Are we asking what the typical copy of ourselves experiences? But then you have some circularity with how do you define what typical is without presupposing some notion of probability. Certainly some of the copies that we generate are, you know, very maverick copies who see very strange phenomena because they're on very strange branches. But we discount their experiences because their experiences are very different from what's predicted by the physical theory and would be self-undermining, or we don't. It's a little bit complicated exactly how to apply some of these metaphysical demands, these naturalistic metaphysical demands, because they rely on we, and then the we itself is kind of a confusing, somewhat difficult to discern notion. So I don't have a coherent question exactly here, except that I'm wondering if maybe these demands are maybe not even quite broad enough to encompass some of the physical theories that we're considering because of the way they use the word we.
I mean, to be honest, I mean, here I would put, here's the form of this question. How does this account apply in the case of many worlds quantum mechanics? And the answer broadly is that I think it suggests that it's a possible view, but we need a lot to get there. So I don't think from my point of view, I don't think the worry is with explanatory demands. I think it's with the current state of understanding of many worlds quantum mechanics, where, you know, you have quite different ontological proposals, you have quite different ways of thinking about, well, some different ways of thinking about probability. Effectively, I think there is some sense you can make of many worlds quantum mechanics answering some of these demands, but it will also require, you know, definitely changing a lot of the way our concepts in science were already working. So even at best, it's quite revisionist, unsurprisingly. But yeah, my thought is that you will have to answer these explanatory demands given different specifications of what you mean by the we. And again, it's basically about like explaining the phenomena you think is worthy of explanation. That's going to vary theory by theory. But you had, I mean, there are definitely worries in this camp because you can't just discount the strange experiences your theory predicts because they're strange. So there definitely is an onus on many worlds quantum mechanics to kind of front up to do the explanatory work that's required here.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Next I have Stephen. Stephen, please go ahead.
Hi, Alison. Thanks very much for the nice talk. You mentioned when talking about modality, I think you said that naturalistic methods of knowing are not limited to the non-modal actual. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what you mean by that. It seems to me, at least naively, that there is at least a sense in which we are epistemically limited to the non-modal actual, insofar as data is non-modal, right? The results of experiments are non-modal facts. So, and I know that there, historically there have been worries about, theory latedness of data. Maybe there are concerns about some kind of modality latedness of data, but insofar as data, as the results of experiments are just facts, just non-modal facts, it seems like that is where, at least for me, the intuition comes from, that there should be some kind of reduction of modality to the non-modal.
Yeah, no, I think that's reasonable. Definitely is an account of why we have this intuition, why our access to the non-modal actual seems somehow like direct and clear and non-strange. Doesn't need much way of explanation. I guess I have two things in response. One is that, the claim should never have just been about our direct knowledge. It should be about our knowledge simpliciter. And again, even though we might be unsure about how exactly scientific method works, we definitely should be thinking that scientific method gives us access to the modal stuff. So in a certain sense, it's kind of saying, look, fill in the blank in however way you want, but at least a straightforward understanding of the scientific enterprise is that it is aspiring to give you non-direct access to these things, even though, of course, the fact that we have direct access to the data might lead you to think there's some kind of additional puzzle there. It's a puzzle that we think has a solution, rather than a puzzle that says we should get rid of that problem altogether because it can't be solved. The other aspect, very much brings to something you said, which is, look, I think this kind of picture of the world where we have access to kind of the shapes and positions and of things, and that's kind of non-problematic, and it's only once we start inferring to other stuff that it gets problematic. I think it is kind of weird, partly because of the theory ladeness of observation, partly because, our perceptual apparatus isn't just about kind of seeing X at this point in space and time, it's kind of more complicated than that. So I think we sort of come to have this expectation that we're sort of confronted with a kind of, some kind of three-dimensional spatial slices through time. That was never the right way to think of perception to begin with, I guess. So I think I agree with you about, where the intuition is coming from. I just don't think it stands up to scientific scrutiny, essentially. I think it makes sense for us to have had that thought, but we should get rid of it, something like that.
Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. Next, I have Josh. Josh, please go ahead.
Cool. Thanks so much, Alison. Really enjoyed the talk. Super neat program to be working in. My question is really about what you mean by explanation, I guess specifically naturalistic explanation. So the kind of concern that occurred to me is the norms of what counts as a naturalistic explanation change over time in science, and they plausibly differ in different parts of science. Are you envisioning that philosophers like ourselves can just look to our contemporary best scientific theories, read off what counts as, the criteria for a naturalistic explanation? If two philosophers disagree about whether they've given a naturalistic explanation, maybe one of them thinks, yeah, notion of governance, that's in science. We see governance all the time, or we see metaphysical magnetism in science. And so that's perfectly fine to appeal to. If you have you presumably would disagree with such a philosopher. Do you think that one of you is just objectively mind independently correct? The other one is mistaken about current scientific practice? What would happen if scientists changed? So in the future, scientists start becoming very happy talking about governance, if you think they're not already, then, would you just say, oh yeah, now we're on board with that? Now, we, the philosophers, the functional naturalists can appeal to such notions.
Great question. So one thing which I want to sort of push back against in some of the question is this idea. Yeah, so the sort of naturalism I have in mind is not something where you sort of look at the scientists over there, see what they're doing, and then kind of interpret what they're doing and do more of it yourself. That sounds a little bit too much to me like you're kind of not part of science yourself. You're just kind of observing what they do and kind of adopting their standards without having to think any more about them. So the attitude is more like, sorry, there's just a small puppy here. I'm just going to pick her up and she's going to be fine. Yeah. So the attitude is more like you are yourself a working scientist. As a scientist, you can disagree with some of your fellow scientists. You can agree with others. You're trying to push the scientific program along. You might have different ideas about how to do so, no worries. What this does mean is that, yeah, I can't, you know, if someone really wants to put their foot down and say, look, I think grounding really appears throughout the sciences and it's being used sort of here and there and it's very fruitful, or even if it's not being used here and there, it really should have been, you know, it's really playing this important explanatory role within science. I can't reject that just by saying, hey, it doesn't look like what I like. So it's partly why the complaint, I mean, the examples of complaints I gave from like the direction of time and modality, they were often concerned people who label themselves as being non-scientific at a certain point, or, you know, don't defend it as being something that looks recognizably scientific. It's particularly clear in the Humean case, I think, because often they make a distinction themselves between the use of laws and probabilities and scientific explanation versus its use in metaphysical explanation. I think that distinction sort of gets them out of some of the problems I was raising. So yeah, effectively, like the view might look much weaker given that kind of concession. But I think, to be honest, like I don't think we should be any more dogmatic about what form explanation takes. I mean, I know you didn't go here with your question, but like one thing that comes up for me, for example, is if you're doing the project of explaining temporal asymmetries, most models of explanation won't work for you. And, you know, most scientists aren't interested in that kind of puzzle. And so, you know, I do actually think that a lot of the literature on explanation needs some kind of work. So I'm kind of one of these sort of somewhat revisionist people. And yeah, and for this reason as well, it's not like, yeah, I should be more careful sometimes. Like it's not, as with notions like grounding, it's not like metaphysical magnetism could never work. It's just that not much is being said about how it works. So you do get these claims that, like, you know, literally because something is metaphysically fundamental, we automatically have epistemic access to it. You know, even it just looks like bad science if it were to be taken as science. But yeah, it doesn't rule out the possibility of making that look plausible, I guess.
Cool, thanks so much. That really clarifies the view a lot.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks, Josh. Nina, I have you next.
Thanks. I recently lost my voice, so hopefully you can understand me, but I sound a little funny. Thanks for the great talk, Alison. And I had a series of questions about like sort of a cluster of questions about the explanatory demands, some of which overlapped with the last question, but maybe I'll put it this way. I'm curious where the explanatory demands come from. Not because I don't like them, I think I do, but I'm curious like what their source is. And maybe one way to push on it is to sorry, my dog is bothering me too. One way to push on it is to say, so if we weren't methodological naturalists, do you think we should still, we're still required to satisfy the explanatory demands? We could just satisfy them in a non-naturalistic way. So like or are the explanatory demands themselves being generated by our commitment to methodological naturalism?
Good. I think, I'll have to think through what the overall answer is, but let me give you the steps along the way. So most of the explanatory demands are basically, here's a phenomena that people in this investigation accept. You know, we have some intuitions, we have some concepts, yada, yada. Please explain this phenomena. It seems like the kind of thing that you could do. The reason why they're being kind of roped into this account is that given the way metaphysics of science discussions have gone, they're sort of useful to rope in at this point. You know, because I think we've made mistakes about intuitions and so forth, you know, we should rope them in at that. They are kind of particularly relevant for advancing this debate. But that's sort of a contingent matter. I can kind of see a state of play where it wouldn't be so helpful. They'd still be demands, but they would kind of be, you know, less helpful for the discussion. So I think my thought is, they would be demands even if we weren't naturalistic. The naturalism only kind of limits you to certain ways of answering them. But I can see kinds of views which would, you could have a certain methodological view which just makes them much less interesting for different kinds of other reasons. So I haven't sort of pressed this a lot here, but I really do think the unity of science stuff is partly what drives some of the idea of explanatory demands, because you're trying to kind of put together your psychological accounts of how we come to know stuff with your kind of deepest accounts of what the world is like. I can kind of half squint at a kind of more piecemeal approach to science, which just isn't interested in those questions and doesn't think that all questions of that form will be well posed or something like that. So I guess that's kind of a split answer. I personally think the demands should be in place and would be useful even if you weren't a naturalist, but given certain views one might adopt, that might be a reason to reject them.
Okay, I think I'm getting it. I mean, so are the explanatory demands themselves, are they part of the methodology of science? Or are they prior to the methodology of science?
No, I mean, I wouldn't even think that I think the best way of answering this, it's kind of getting tricky. So it depends how you define what counts as a scientific method. Does the posing of certain kinds of questions count as part of your scientific method? On one way of thinking about it, no, the requirement is that once you've posed the question, you then answer it using appropriate resources. Science doesn't tell you what questions to ask, it just kind of gives you answers. And that's a bit odd though. I think part of doing good science is figuring out what questions ought to be asked as well. And so at least for me as a naturalist, looking at a metaphysical debate and thinking that it would be fruitfully advanced by asking certain kinds of questions, that is a kind of current aspect of the methodology. But it is kind of a contingent one. Like, it's not sort of like a priori, we could have told this would always be a helpful move. It's more like, given the kind of mistakes we tend to make as humans, this will be a helpful way of advancing this kind of scientific project.
Okay, that's super helpful. Thanks, Alison.
Thanks.
Thanks, Nina. Next, I have David Kovacs.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for the talk. This was really interesting. I very much enjoyed it. So I think my question taps into Josh's question 2 questions ago. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about this magnetism, the magnetism solution or the magnetism approach to this issue, as opposed to this more pragmatically oriented one. And I guess what I wasn't sure about is why, at least on some ways of understanding, sorry, I wanted to say magnetism. So why on some ways of understanding what magnetism consists in, why is that incompatible with focusing on usefulness? So you yourself express some caution about this because there are various different views that could fit under magnetism. But at least for Lewis, to whom this kind of view is usually attributed. So at least for Lewis, magnetism is part of his theory of content. It comes to the fore as part of what it takes to be the ideal solution to this problem of radical interpretation. So for Lewis, at least, part of the work that magnetic properties or more broadly magnetic concepts do is that they're more eligible to serve as mental contents. They are more eligible to enter mental contents because they are those sorts of concepts such that thinking in terms of them is usually more conducive to true beliefs. It's more conducive to the survival of the individual who holds beliefs couched in terms of such concepts, and so on and so on. So why? So there's magnetism and magnetism, and you can of course give this very extreme theory when some concepts are just magnetic, and that's that. It's a primitive feature, but it could also come in the context of a much broader theory of mental content, among other things. And then I don't immediately see why there's necessarily a problem with the naturalistic credentials of that kind of approach, and I also don't necessarily see why it couldn't be basically a way of cashing out this how certain concepts might just be more useful to think in terms of. They might be more useful precisely because they are magnetic. All right, I stop here. I hope that was sufficiently clear.
Yeah, no, it was. I mean, I think I've got like a couple of responses. One is that, like, at least of my reading of the role that magnetism plays for Lewis, I don't think it should be thought of in a strongly functionalist pragmatist terms as you're suggesting there, that, we pick up on like the way the magnetism works is because that stuff is useful to us and that's how we pick up on it. That sounds much more like a kind of evolutionary functionalist approach. It doesn't sound like the sort of solution of the kind that I think take it Lewis offers. So yeah, the more functionalist thing you were saying, that I think sounds very naturalistic. I just don't think it falls under the label of what Lewis had in mind by magnetism. But the broader answer, yeah. So I think there's something that's a feature that's often shared in common, but in the metaphysical accounts that I'm labeling as non-naturalistic, or ones that I don't like. And one way of labeling it is that they effectively try to link up two scientific areas that are very disparate without having to do the steps in between. So in the case of direction of time issues, you posit a fundamental direction of time, and that is somehow directly meant to like affect our reactive attitudes or our intuitions about time without having to tell a story about how the intermediate effects works. And that, it's not that there isn't some sort of story, but you have to do all the in-between layers. You have to explain how the direction of time give rise to probabilistic asymmetries and so forth. And I think I would say a similar thing in these cases. So because magnetism and its ilk are typically used to, give interpretations, explain how our mental content and language latches onto certain things, these are quite high-level agential things, and presumably we'd want some steps along the way. Whereas it looks more like, labeling something having with a relatively fundamental metaphysical property, like, sometimes it's naturalness, sometimes it's fundamentality, sometimes it's something else, is somehow meant to give us quite a high-level explanation without having to do any of the steps in between. And I think that, the contrast is something like, Craig Callander's book, What Makes Time Special, which even if it doesn't give all the details, it tells us a plausible story how features of time at a relatively fundamental physical level give rise to kind of biological aspects, which will then give rise to psychological aspects, and so forth. I don't put all of this in terms of unity of science, but effectively, like, it kind of gets in the way of other scientific areas offering good explanations of what they need to. In this case, it will be stories about, evolution of language and how language functions and mental content and so forth. So yeah, it's kind of when you're skipping stages that I get worried about it being non-naturalistic.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. The skipping stages. All right, thank you.
Cool. Thanks, David. Next, Dave Baker. Go ahead, Dave. Good to see you.
Likewise. Hey. Yeah, really deep stuff. Thank you. I guess, like, this is a question about how does the whole kind of picture hang together, right? But it's also a fairly localized question. So, like, it seems to me that one of the things that we have discovered scientifically is that facts about the arrow of time are explanatorily prior to facts about what is useful to us, and not vice versa. And I don't see how, like, that kind of fits with the view, I guess. So I guess that's just the question.
I'm not sure I'm going to disagree with you here. So, like, there's different things you might mean, I guess, by explanatorily prior. So if we're meaning in terms of kind of a very roughly put, but kind of understood hierarchy of sciences, where you have something like fundamental physics on the bottom with its aspiration to explain, say, the success of other sciences, then on this kind of view, the features of time are going to be relatively fundamental, maybe just a bit up from the bottom, given our current scientific view, but, certainly prior to stuff about agency or intuitions or anything like that. So that's explanatory direction in one sense, what can explain kind of other areas of science. But in the sense of kind of what explanatory questions will be useful to ask at a given stage of investigation, that's a different kind of explanatory priority. It's not saying that these things are kind of more ontologically basic or more basic in this kind of unity of science picture, but helpful to ask now. And I mean, what's interesting about the explanatory demands is because they're quite weak and kind of take this kind of interesting form, you can indeed ask them of all these areas. There's a kind of, I don't know if you call it pragmatic or like performative element to it, but because we're the people trying to do the discovering, we know that we're having these investigations, acquiring these concepts, claiming to know these theories. We're kind of creating the phenomena as we're investigating them, the phenomena of having these concepts, having this knowledge, etc. So in a certain sense, they're kind of, these explanatory demands in their very loose and general form are quite close to us because we're the ones doing the investigating. But it doesn't mean that they're kind of, like deeper facts about the world or, ought to be answered before we answer other things. Answering these demands will require, resources from all sorts of other sciences. So I guess, I don't think of them as being, one way I think of them is in terms of kind of coherence constraints. So it's really putting constraints on how a whole bunch of theories relate to one another, rather than a kind of answer these first in science and then go on to do your other science. That would be kind of strange. Does that help?
It does. I mean, it makes it a little harder to understand how it's kind of an alternative to the magnetism type views, I guess, since those are about explanation in the sense of like in the sense that the arrow of time is more fundamental than, you see what I'm saying? Like it's like those are about explanations in the sense where the order is the order of fundamentality, right? So it's like yeah.
The complaint about them isn't about like the level at which they do the explaining. You can explain, in various explanations, you'll use some combination of higher and lower level stuff. This is fine. The complaint against them is that they kind of delete important scientific work and kind of condense, skip stages that sort of gets in the way of this kind of nice, pretty unity of science that I want. So it's not that, it's that you need to tell the story of how that fundamental stuff sort of percolates upwards to like eventually us having knowledge and intuitions and yada yada. And some of those stories skip those steps.
Thanks, Dave. And you also get 5 bonus points for literally being a philosopher in an armchair. Alex, you're next.
Hi, Alison. Thanks for that. That was really, really great. And I think I'm somewhat persuaded, more than I want to be. But I was just kind of wondering if you can say a little bit more about whether or not you think there's any kind of scope or role for metaphysical analysis that goes beyond this kind of purely methodological naturalism. And I was thinking in 2 sort of contexts, or maybe very closely related contexts, where we might want to do something like think about what probability is, or what causation is, or what laws are, in a way that doesn't just involve, applying the scientific method, or maybe you've got like kind of just a broader parameter of what you think applying scientific method is. So and this is stuff I think about the context in which I'm thinking about this is kind of like theory reduction and emergence, we might want to think about what laws are, because we want to see whether or not the kind of regularities or dependencies that we discover in higher level sciences are laws, and what in the lower level sciences kind of instantiates them, or how, you know, structures come together to make laws or make probability in the high level. I think that might involve, and also thinking like reduction of causation in a scientific sense, like how non-physical theories that have something like more robust causation than we might find in physics, how that comes about might involve something like an analysis of causation, which isn't just following scientific method. And then the last example was, again, because it's been brought up already, sort of ever interpretation type stuff. We might think like, well, if I've got, say, a Lewisian account of what probability is, then I know how to find what probability is at some emergent level within something like within some world. Whereas if I don't have this, then I'm kind of at sea in this question of like how to locate probability in this kind of theory that's just totally at odds with our intuitions. Sorry, that was longer than I expected to be.
No worries. I mean, I think my basic answer is, yeah, this all sounds fine. So I do have quite a broad understanding of what counts as methods of science here. In keeping with what some remarks I made earlier, you know, it can involve being quite revisionist, even against, you know, scientific orthodoxy. You know, a lot of my own work is about kind of offering accounts of scientific relations that don't have much in common with what scientists themselves are going to say about, you know, these things. So even like the evidential biconditional, you know, a lot of that work is driven by, here's a good function that something should be serving. It looks like this relation will serve that function well if it's like this. How about it being this? A kind of proposal. And yeah, with regard to reduction as well, like, when sort of somewhere early in the talk, I gave kind of 3 things we might do for sort of theories, and one is improving how well they cohere with one another. And I take a lot of kind of questions broadly in the kind of reductionist debate are about how theories cohere with one another. At least for myself, yeah, this unity of science stuff keeps kind of popping up, and it's something I'm clearly very strongly committed to. I don't think it's kind of against scientific practice, but I know, you know, as with a lot of this, I don't think scientific practice sort of as practiced by scientists kind of settles. We ought to be unity of science people of the kind that I like. So I'm willing to be kind of revisionist there as well. So yeah, broadly, quite a lot can get allowed under this kind of naturalistic methodology. I guess the important point for me is at the end of the day, you do get kind of a unified picture where things that we would call metaphysics and things that we would typically call science relate to each other broadly in the same way that other sciences relate to each other. They're not different in kind. They need to be conciled in some kind of way. That's a bit hand wavy, but that's kind of the picture. And yeah, and there's a lot of stuff you might have to do along the way in order to get that to happen, including things that look like conceptual analysis, including, you know, considering unusual proposals. Like a lot of stuff can happen still.
Okay, thank you. No, I think that helps a lot. So the main thing you really want to rule out is the kind of when the Humean says things that are just incompatible with what the scientists regard as possible, or saying that kind of.
Even more strong, or even I put it slightly differently, like incompatible with the very science that they want to keep. So the Humean is not being revisionist about the science. They're saying, I want to keep science exactly as it is, and then offering a proposal which doesn't cohere well with that. So that's their kind of mistake. Yeah, so that's the thing. I'm willing to consider kind of revisions to science. That's fine, but it has to kind of still cohere nicely together. I was going to say something else, but I think that might be it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Next, I have Nanxing.
Thank you for the illuminating talk. So as half-hearted Humean, I might want to push back a little bit. So so some of my questions are similar to what Alex just said. So I think some of the metaphysicians may want to ask questions about like what is laws of nature, or what are laws of nature, or what are probability, what are causation. And I think the motivation for Humean is that the Humeans are trying to provide an account for these questions at a more parsimonious, a more unified way, right? So, so your methodological naturalism is trying to be unified with science in a sense, but even in science. But I assume that what you mean by science, you mean just natural science or mostly fundamental physics. But even within science, there are different disciplines. The criteria for the explanations are not so unified, so to speak. And I think, in a sense, maybe metaphysics, the criteria for evaluating an explanation in metaphysics will also be somewhat different from how you're evaluating an explanation in science.
I think there might be a few questions there. I'll try and say something that will address it. So I have no objection to parsimony being a theoretical virtue, something that's in favor of the view. I don't think it's enough to get you Humeanism, basically. I think you run into the problems I described long before parsimony will put you over the line to prefer one of those views. The sciences I have in mind are typically all the sciences with a kind of, probably a vague boundary on what will count as all, but I don't have just fundamental physics in mind, partly because I don't think even causation is well understood in that domain. I think it's easier to understand causation when you look to high level sciences. Yeah, because I think my main concern with the Humean program is that even though it presents as kind of recovering science, what is really driving the need for reduction is something much closer to intuition about what is mysterious. And you will find Humean talking about the mysteriousness of modality, and they have in mind something, they're kind of pre-theoretic. I find this strange. So yeah, that's part of the worry is that, what's prompting the Humean program, I think, is a bit suspect sometimes. But the bigger concern is that I don't think it provides a unified account of a kind of thing I think we should expect from science. So it's a kind of, I was a Humean for a while as well because I didn't see the issues, and I was like, why not? You should provide accounts of things. And there's no, the naturalism I have in mind doesn't tell you when to stop reducing, for a reduction of a pretty minimal kind. I'm very happy with reductions when they can happen, but there have to be reductions that kind of go well with the unity of science. Once they start to break that unity, that's when I'm kind of off the boat.
Yeah, but Humean doesn't seem to break the unity of science. It's just sort of the breaking of unity is at a different level, right? So, for example, Humean says that what probabilities are, they are not saying that for pragmatic reasons, we should not use the mathematical probability in science, right? So they're just saying that at a metaphysical level, it might be something else.
So the very comment you're making is precisely what the problem is for me. If you're talking about there being a metaphysical level that is distinct from a scientific level, that's the bit that I'm chucking out with my methodological naturalism and my unity of science.
Okay, thank you.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks a lot. Next, I have Cordelia.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful talk. I think my question rhymes a little with Alex's and Nanshan's. So it's really about the part in the argument where we see the dismissal of anti-realisms. And my wonder was, in saying that the function of a concept depends on the existence and features of the thing itself, I wonder whether we're either imposing some metaphysical commitment on scientific inquiry, or else engaging in fairly aggressive conceptual revision on existence. And the reason what I'm wondering about specifically is cases where someone like a scientific practitioner might want to posit a concept that works in your sense here, whose use, right, they might feel fairly confident about, but whose existence they might feel like quite uncomfortable claiming. And so my question is kind of it seems like there are kind of like one direction here would be to say that the way that existence is being talked about here is quite naive and needs to be reframed in terms of like what it is we can talk about sensibly, or I don't know, in the direction of like meta-linguistic commitments or something. But I wonder how this is in turn squared with the kind of like methodological naturalism. And so I'm wondering if we have to say to the scientist, like existence, that the kind of like intuition on ontology here is wrong, whether we're not back at the metaphysics.
I hope this might be a quick and helpful answer, but tell me if it's not. I don't think it's always the case that the usefulness of a concept depends on the existence of the thing itself. Often the case, but not always. And even the direction of time might be an example where, you know, of course, talk of the past and future and the present are incredibly helpful, even if, I mean, I don't think there is really a metaphysical stand-in for the past, the present, and the future, and perhaps probably not even for the direction of time either. So that was just sort of a helpful gloss to say this kind of functionalism about concepts doesn't rule out being a kind of flat-footed realist, not to say that one is a flat-footed realist in virtue of taking up this kind of functionalism. There are some, you know, broader questions about, you know, what to say about existence, what to say about realism, given this kind of stance. As far as I can tell, the kind of stance I'm describing is going to allow for flat-footed realism or for a kind of deflationism about the realism debate. I used to play around with calling it an anti-realist view, but I sort of gave that up because people got the wrong impression. But, you know, it looks sometimes a bit like Fine's natural ontological attitude, or sort of, yeah, things which have been counted under the banner of, look, there isn't a sense, like, once I've done my science, I'm done. Like, there isn't a further question to ask, you know, did I really get it right, or something like that. But yeah, I don't think it's going to settle some further debates one could have about realism in these settings. Does that help?
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Cool.
Thanks so much. Next, I have Lev. Nice to see you, Lev.
Hello, Alison. Hello.
Hey.
I'm still in the process of learning language. And metaphysics and modalities, these are concepts which I still have difficulty. You define metaphysics is about what exists and how it works. For me, it's science. And you presented there is some dichotomy. There is scientific method and there is a metaphysics. For me, philosophers are supposed to help scientists. There are no two things. I don't understand this. I don't understand a difference. On the other hand, I think I had just a second question. I think I have some progress with modality. For me, scientific method is that there are some laws of nature and there are contingent initial conditions. Really, there is only one initial condition, and then there is an actual universe. But the whole science, the whole idea of science, that it should consider all kinds of possible conditions. So the other one, this model relation, is just a statement about possible initial conditions which are not real. And then this seems very kind of simple, unproblematic, and this might be a solution for this difficulty. Well, what is your reaction?
I mean, I think on both points, I just agree. So I was against there being a dichotomy between metaphysics and science. I'm in favor of there being a single discipline that is kind of both. So that bit we agree on for the first question. For the second question about modality, yeah, I mean, there are some funny things to explore about the direction of time and whatnot, but as a basic view of modal relations like laws, I'm broadly in agreement. The only thing that's kind of funny about my position with respect to laws and probabilities is that a lot of those views think of laws or probabilities as having a kind of causal productive force that happens towards the future and not the past. For issues broadly to do with the direction of time, I don't countenance that. But yeah, you know, you have the actual events. The laws effectively make claims not just about the actual events, but about how different states of the universe at different, roughly call them times of the day, would evolve in different ways. Great, you know, that's kind of a lot of how laws function, a lot of what they do. I will say a lot of people look at my quote unquote accounts of laws and probabilities and say it doesn't count as giving an account because it doesn't do enough of the kind of metaphysical work of saying what they really are with some kind of capital R really. But I've, you know, that's why I started with this very minimalist definition of what metaphysics is doing. It's just saying what some things are and what they're like, and these will count as accounts by those very minimal criteria. So yeah, I think we're in agreement basically. I don't think there's a disagreement here.
So maybe just one clarification about probability. Can it be that it's just ignorance, as there is no probability, everything, there is a block universe or block multiverse, and there is no genuine probability, but there are situations that you don't know in which hand there is a coin, and then it looks for you like probability, but there is no really, this is just simple ignorance, which is also not problematic philosophically. Can it be so?
So my general attitude is that the probabilities are as real as the laws are, which isn't necessarily helpful if you're not sure how real the laws are. But, you know, by those criterion, laws aren't merely about our ignorance. Laws are real in the same way probabilities, even in cases where you have deterministic laws, they're equally real and not just about our ignorance. And, you know, at this point, I kind of import the standard arguments you see in the literature about the fact that we use probabilities in explanations and in derivations in ways that treat them, again, as real as the laws are. So, yeah, sorry, I'm running out of thinking time, but yes, that's broadly my view. They are real, no matter whether the laws are deterministic or indeterministic.
Well, maybe we'll meet sometimes. You'll explain probability. I want to leave 2 minutes or 3 minutes to Guy.
Thanks, Lev.
Thank
Guy,
you.
go ahead.
Thank you. So actually, most of the question that I wanted to ask was already answered in your answer to Cordelia about realism. But I want just to pick on some small things. So about the so it seems that on one hand, realism, questions that have to do on realism or the far end of your project, you'll have to work really hard to say something about this debate when you're taking this approach. And well, it makes sense. But on the other hand, as there is this unity of science, which has this basic approach, and it seems that would make lots of sense to motivate it based on some sort of metaphysical realism, or even more than that. So it's also at the basic level. So yeah, that's the question.
Excellent question. Thank you. It's a good one to leave on. So yeah, for a long time, even before I got to my methodological naturalism, I was someone who thought that the unity of science did not need to be supported by a metaphysical view that we typically call realism. So I've always been sort of broadly pragmatist or instrumentalist about unity. It's really helpful to have. These days, I'm probably in this kind of annoying middle camp, which says something like, look, both the world and our needs need to cooperate in anything serving a certain function. So, you know, it could have been that the world was horribly disunified such that we wouldn't have a good way of putting our different sciences together. But because the world is sufficiently unified and because unity is helpful for us in our investigations, you know, we ought to develop a unified picture. So I guess the only thing I'm cutting out here is and the reason I'm not engaging in the scientific realism debate is that it's often, to my mind, kind of ill-formed, and you get into a lot of semantics. But insofar as it was some kind of extra scientific claim that said, there's an external mind-independent world, and that is going to explain the success of science, I just didn't get it. Once you posit a theory and say this is true of the world, you can then explain why that theory was helpful. But that's a kind of circular thing that even the anti-realist can say. So I guess I am certainly against using the unity of science or the naturalistic metaphysics to kind of support what you would typically call like a metaphysical realism of a strong kind. Again, the reason I'm being a bit funny about this, people like Quine are sometimes trotted out as being staunch realists, and this is quite compatible with kind of a Quinean view, which just kind of does more science. So yeah, I do have some stake in that debate, but the debate annoys me for various reasons at the moment.
Thanks for the answer. I would want to hear more about it, but no, thank you very much.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks to everyone for your questions. And I want to thank Alison again for an amazing talk and running an amazing discussion and Q&A. So thanks. Awesome work, everybody.
Thanks for all the great questions. It was really helpful.
It's great. And thanks for spending this 2 hours with us. I know everyone's time is really precious. So stay tuned. There'll be an announcement for the next seminar talk in 2 weeks. We have Barry Lower scheduled for the next speaker. So stay tuned for that announcement. And until then, it's good to see everybody. Be safe, be well. Bye, everybody.